Well, Bill, actually, before we start, I feel compelled to issue a sort of warning to the audience. There's this horrible 21st century phrase, spoiler alert. Last weekend, John Oliver on his HBO show did a funny thing where he had some clips of TV pundits misusing the expression, saying things like, "What's going to happen next Tuesday? Spoiler alert, no one knows." Whatever else we're going to talk about this evening, I hope we're going to talk about The Peripheral, and I'm feeling a little guilty about it because the people who are in this room who have not yet read it will not have, after this conversation, the purest possible experience of reading the book, where one mystery is presented and then unfolds after another. And so this is my spoiler alert. If that bothers you, you should leave now. One thing that strikes me about this book is that from the beginning, and for a great part of it, you really don't know where you are. You don't know when you are. And you don't know the rules of the game that's being played. I want to just read the first sentence because it's so striking, and you're famous for your first sentences. I bet there are a lot of people in this audience who could recite from memory the first sentence of Neuromancer. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. The first sentence of The Peripheral is, they didn't think Flynn's brother had PTSD, but that sometimes the haptics glitched him. So there's 14 words, and already we're lost. Haptics, glitched. Do you have any defense? I mean, is that, well, did you worry that this book was going to be difficult?
I worked on the first paragraph for however many years it took to write the book, and that sentence moved around. It went from the top to the middle of the page, and back to the top. And this book, maybe more than previous books, my guide for what it needed to be or what it wanted to be was simply that if I made a misstep, or if I made an executive decision that wasn't in line with what it was becoming, it would stop coming. And it was like down tools for however many days until I reversed that decision and allowed it to be what it seemed to be in order for it to continue in my imagination. So I never made a single executive decision about that sentence. It was like a palimpsest. It was, overwritten 8,000 times. And that was what finally flooded to the surface. But when I look at it as objectively as I can now, which is arguably not very, but when I try to be objective about it, I see that you get PTSD, and the reader either knows what that is or not. And if the reader doesn't know what that is, they're probably not ready for the book. And you get haptics, which isn't that broadly familiar yet, and assuming that you know you're reading a science fiction text, you don't know what haptics might mean in terms of the scenario you're entering, but glitched, but if you're somewhat computer literate, makes a certain kind of sense. But most important, the sentence is, the style of the sentence is wholly colloquial. It's not formal. It's not formal at all. It's colloquial and to some extent underclass. So in that first sentence, there are ways in which, without knowing it, you are already within the matrix of the narrative.
A word like haptics you can look up. You know, the reader can reach into his or her pocket and look it up on Wikipedia. But one of the things about being in William Gibson land is that you never know whether an unfamiliar word is a real word or something new that you've just invented.
Or a real word being used in an unfamiliar sociolinguistic context.
Right. And there are a lot of those. And there's a lot of, well, it just occurs to me at random that there's a lot of printing in this book. Things are printed.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, they aren't printed on paper.
No.
And we already have 3D printers in the world. So maybe in that world, people are already just talking about printing in that colloquial way. Or maybe you've just gotten ahead a little bit. Do you even know yourself?
Well, the book has two time frames in a sense, and the nearest time frame is just a few clicks away from ours. It's as I thought after I'd been in it for a little while, it's winter's bone with better smartphones, or it's justified with drones. It's not a stretch, and it was. Every time I came back to that, because these frames alternate 1, 2, 1, 2 through the book. Every time I came back to the nearer one, it was just like being home. There was relatively no effort required to mount the sets and you know, spin the futuristic technology, because they're so close. They're so close to ours. And I wouldn't think that there would be. I wouldn't think that a book written in time frame A, the nearer one, would be difficult at all, for the most part. Or, you know, for people who have that extra little bit of literary superstructure that one arguably needs to read science fiction of this sort, the first time frame is, I think, would be relatively easy to negotiate.
So another thing that isn't obvious in the first sentence is, and I have a feeling that this is deliberate, is that Flynn is a woman. Flynn is the protagonist of this book, I think you could say.
Yeah.
Well, one of them.
Yeah.
It strikes me that you have, through your career, created a series of memorable women as your heroes, as your heroines, and
Yeah.
and it feels as though that's not typical in your business, in the genre. It's often kind of a guy's genre, a boy's genre. Certainly, when I was reading science fiction novels growing up, it was always boys running off to pilot those spaceships.
Yeah, it was certainly, and I too read science fiction in that era, and that was, certainly going on.
And you've had some some particularly, there's something odd about some of your women. Well, I mean, in Neuromancer, in your very first novel, maybe the protagonist is Case. It's kind of cyber cowboy, and he's a man. But then there's Molly. Can you show the image of Molly for a second? Well, this is an artist's, a Brazilian artist's rendition of Molly, and her eyes are not real, and she is ferocious and scary, and well, maybe I should let you say, but it feels as though some of the qualities of these women run through a lot of your work.
Well, when I decided, for whatever reason, and it now, when I think about it, it baffles me, why I thought it would be a smart idea to become a science fiction writer. In the early 80s, and I know that part of it was that I thought that science fiction in the early 80s compared to the science fiction I had read in the 60s, not the older science fiction, but the science fiction of the mid-60s, I felt like someone who'd grown up with Texas swing and Delta blues, and gone to the store to buy some, and they had nothing but Nashville country. So I thought of science fiction as a once viable pop modality that was just in terrible shape. Like I was looking for 80s SF that would excite me. And one of the most exciting things in science fiction around the time I started was feminist science fiction, which happened accidentally to be centered in Seattle, the American city closest to the Canadian city I was living in. And Seattle had a much more viable professional, semi-professional science fiction community. So I would go down to their science fiction conventions, and I met Joanna Russ and Vonda McIntyre, and I heard Ursula Le Guin. And these women were feminists, avowedly so, and engaged in a critique of the genre as it then existed. And so they were the first people I ever heard refer to the patriarchy. I'm sure of it. They were the very first people. And they convinced me to whatever extent, so that when I started to write, in the list of things that I didn't want to do, like I don't want to create futures which are essentially the United States writ large, and I don't want to create futures in which the only real people are Caucasian. And then I had one that said, I don't want to create futures which are inherently sexist or further the existing sexism of the world. So I don't think it wasn't like I was a big ideologue, but those were things I didn't want to do in the 80s. And I just sort of had them, and there was like an invisible post-it beside the typewriter. Don't do these things. And I so I deliberately worked counter to all of that, and Neuromancer it was even more conscious when I was writing Neuromancer because it hadn't yet become second nature. It was a first novel, and it's very raw, and I had technically very little idea of what I was doing, but I would refer to the post-it. And when Molly was written, the sort of figure that she is, the deadly kick-ass babe, wasn't the really common figure that it is now, that she is now.
Yeah.
That, you know, no one had yet seen Angela Jolie do the same turn, but they would. And I think that it was time, really. And I'm not saying that I influenced it. I think it was time. I think I picked up on something in the zeitgeist that was happening.
Maybe the girl with the dragon tattoo is another Gibson hero in a way.
Well, that's a stranger case because I'm sorry, I've forgotten the author's name, but I've read that some years prior to writing those books, he was a member of his local science fiction club. And he would have read Neuromancer. So when I read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, I was sort of like,
It did
I
seem
kind of
familiar,
I kind of get this. It wasn't the same, but you know. But on the other hand, Neuromancer is filled with me doing exactly the same thing. I could annotate Neuromancer and I probably should at some point, just so people will know where the bits and pieces came from.
I want to ask you about another amazing character in the Peripheral, who doesn't seem very Gibsonian to me, and strikes me as strange in various ways, and that is Ainsley Lobier. She's a cop. I'd like to, unless you want to read it, I'd like to read just the description of her.
Please,
I bet they'd rather hear you read it.
No, I'd rather hear you read it.
So we meet Ainsley Lobier, Detective Inspector of the Metropolitan Police. Her face and hands were a uniformly pale pink, as though she were lightly inflated with something not quite so dark as blood. Her hair, short and businesslike at the back and sides, was thick and perfectly white, like sugary cream, and swept up in a sort of buoyant forelock. Her eyes, too brightly periwinkle — by the way, I had to look up periwinkle to find out what color that is — were sharply watchful. She wore a suit as ambiguous as she was, either Savile Row or Jermyn Street, not one stitch placed by robot or peripheral. The jacket's cut accommodated broad shoulders, her trousers ending above a banker's very precise black Oxfords revealed slender ankles in sheer black hose. Now, I have promised that we might talk about fashion, but the thing about Ainsley Lobier that strikes me is she's a law enforcement official, kind of a super cop, it turns out, because the Metropolitan Police turn out to be more like the Stasi on steroids than... and we like her. At least I liked her. She's smart, she is competent, she gets things done, she appears to be not corrupt. And I suddenly thought, well, that's how the police are supposed to be in a certain kind of book, but that's not usually how they are in your books.
Well, I haven't had many. I don't think I've had many actual law enforcement officers in in my fiction. Bruce Sterling I once heard Bruce Sterling describe Neuromancer by saying that one of the characters, Peter Riviera, is only there to make the rest of them look good, and that the rest of them are this, steamingly sleazy crew of two-bit criminals and razor boys who you wouldn't want your mother to meet, certainly. And I think he was right. But Neuromancer is also a book in which there are apparently no parents, no spouses, no children, let alone infants, except what children there are monsters conjured up by artificial intelligences, which is all to say that it's a very adolescent book. And I was conscious when I wrote it, even though for all of my very considerable immaturity at the time I wrote it, I was conscious of quite deliberately channeling what adolescence remained to me. I needed it to get that sort of book up and running, so that's why there are no parents. It's a teenage boy's book, basically, and when I was a teenage boy was when I was most passionately into science fiction as a reader. And I think that's in part why Neuromancer is the way it is. And I think that as a result of that, I have a certain reader in the world, and he is sort of cyclically reborn every 5 or 6 years. There'll be a new generation of him turning up, wanting that experience. And then he goes to the later books, and he goes, "Oh, I don't know, it's about pants," or it has parents or babies, ooh. So then I guess he goes and finds Count Zero and Lisa Overdrive and makes do with those books. But I'm not the same man who wrote Neuromancer, I'm glad to say. And there are things in Neuromancer, for instance, a daughter caring for her chronically ill mother, which I think would give Molly Millions a nervous breakdown. Like any of the characters in Neuromancer would flee screaming from that scenario. It's the furthest thing from their fictive universe imaginable. But it's just because I'm a little bit, I hope, grown up now.
So let me ask you about fashion then. Because maybe this has become an interest as you grew older. But am I right in thinking, well, that was a very detailed and specific description of Officer Lobier. It was kind of ladies' vogue combined with sci-fi.
Well, at the same time, Flynn would be unable to render it. Her characters, her lens of character neither contains that knowledge nor that vocabulary. Netherton, the other protagonist, who is a native of that world and profoundly superficial, if nothing else, and painfully aware of class and its symbols, thinks in those terms. That said, it's fairly accurate given that it's fluent. It is, I admit, quite fluent in that the terminology. And the most significant thing about Low-Beer that Netherton tells us as she appears on screen is that he was really grateful that his Lev, his benefactor and soon to be boss, had informed him which personal pronoun she would prefer to be, I don't even know what the verb is, which she would prefer, period. And so the first thing you learn is that her gender would be in question had you not, or might be in question had you not met her before.
And there's a sort of plot hint there. But, when I say fashion, maybe I don't mean in the sense of what appears in the fashion magazines.
No, I know.
But I think back to pattern recognition and the two books that followed it. Did you call them the Big End, or I don't know how that's pronounced? Is it Bijon?
Well,
the Big End.
I call
books?
it Big End because I assume that most of the characters in the books who are pronouncing it that way, being unable to muster the Franco-Belgian pronunciation, as indeed I am myself with a.
I certainly always heard it in my head as Big End,
Yeah,
but then it always
End.
sounds a little funny that way.
But well, it's meant to sound a bit funny.
But my question is, isn't it something about fashion as an idea, as a cultural artifact, feels like not just wallpaper in those books, but the subject of the books. Case Pollard is a fashion something. What?
Well, people, yeah, she
cares a lot about.
She has a morbid sensitivity to certain kinds of branding. So she has to wear only. She's actually, what she is in pattern recognition, I've come to realize is what she's presented as is actually somewhat incoherent, because she's simultaneously presented as someone who will go into anaphylactic shock if they see too much Tommy Hilfiger, and someone who in order to be comfortable needs to escape from design, so that she's famous in her set for a kind of minimalism that she only wears garments that no one appears to have designed. And I don't think those two work entirely well together, and I think of it as kind of a minor flaw in the book, that it's like an incoherence. But I'm not interested in fashion in terms of, the fall season, or what Vogue thinks you should be wearing. I'm sort of interested in the fact that there is Vogue still, and that kind of commentary and permission giving and permission withdraw, retaining, still works in the world. Well, what I'm interested in is in part, it's a more anthropological view of how we dress ourselves. And I'm convinced that even those of us who pride ourselves on having no interest whatever in fashion, no personal style, just not gonna go there, even those of us are actually dressing themselves according to rules and according to cultural parameters. And you only realize this is true when you're walking down the street, and it actually doesn't happen that often, even in New York. You're walking down the street and you encounter someone who's flagrantly breaking several cultural parameters of dress. And it's like, you go, because most people are pretty much in the ballpark. But then we have all these other things that we see people around us doing with clothing or adornment, and we don't. It may be that because I come originally from quite a small town in Southwest Virginia, and it wasn't very sophisticated at all in terms of fashion. But when I left it, I was very interested in how people presented themselves and how people presented themselves in order to be accepted as members of one or another groups in society. I was always very interested in how counterculturalists dressed, whether or not they were counterculturalists who I would have wanted to be associated with. But I still think it's fascinating that apparently in Great Britain there are always several breeding pairs of rockers, say. They'll always be, they will always be there. There will always be mods. And there will always be goths as well, as indeed there's one of my favorite characters in the Peripheral seems to be, if not a goth, then something that could follow on from goth in a darker time.
I'm gonna have to read another description because I think I know who you mean.
Yes.
Unless you want to read it.
No, please. I love hearing
right.
it. I love hearing you read it. It's as if I'm seeing it for the first time.
Okay, this is Ash, right? Goth. It didn't occur to me when I was reading the book that she was goth, but she is in a way. Her skirts and narrow jacket were a baroquely complicated patchwork of raw-edged fragments, some of which, though no doubt flexible, resembled darkened tin. She wore a more ornate reticule than usual, covered in mourning beads, and hung with a sterling affair he knew to be a chatelaine, the organizer for a set of Victorian ladies' household accessories. Or not so Victorian, he saw, as a sterling spider with a faceted jet abdomen on one of the chatelaine's fine chain retainers picked its agile way up from the jacket's waist, its multiple eyes tiny rhinestones.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's different from Case Pollard's style. And when you were describing her style, I was thinking her style of no branding, no bright colors, no words. I was thinking about asking you to, stand up and turn around. But
well, she is Ash is most, most personal fashion statement is that, well, I was about to say she's covered in tattoos. She's not actually covered in them because her tattoos are animated and they're not under her control. So her visible flesh is constantly crossed by herds of bison and flocks of birds, and everything that lives on her flesh is a victim of the Anthropocene extinction. They're all gone. And her, to the extent of my knowledge, which is not complete, her members of her counterculture live as visible manifestations of guilt and mourning for all the species that we've taken down, and the further species that human beings have taken down since her time. And there isn't really any excuse for her flagrant Victoriana, except that I just couldn't resist doing it. It was, it's like my second steampunk moment.
Well,
and the first was the difference engine, and now I'm doing it. When we wrote the difference engine, there was no steampunk, and now there is. So when I do it, my steampunk is inflected with the steampunk of the world.
Well, so let's talk about that, because I think we're starting to drift toward the important time travel subject that I'm dancing around. But this mixture of Victoriana into a very modern, high-tech style of attire, and in the same way, the steampunk thing, you have a way of mixing furnishings of the past and the future in sci-fi that seems very original.
Well, I would argue that it's not. I mean, thank you, but I would argue that it's not terribly original nor unique to me. And the thing we always have to remember is that it's never mixing the past and the future. It's just mixing the past and the past, because no one has actual bits of future to add to the mix. That's a trick. That's an illusion. It's a conjuring trick, really. It's all made of bits, and it's all it's made of bits and pieces of the past, except for those bits that were made of the most recent moment of the present when it was written. But they're put on the table somehow in order to signify the future, and because the reader comes to them to have the future signified. If the reader is willing, it can signify the future, at least for the length of the length of the narrative. But I would say something like Neil Stephenson's *The Diamond Age* does very much the same thing. It's a very future, very high-tech kind of Victoriana. So that's something that's been done. But I think the real key to why the Victorian stuff resonates for us, and maybe why there actually is steampunk walking around in the world, is that we see something of the Victorian age in our own era. Because they're the closest thing to us that ever existed. They lived in a kind of future shock that probably was incredibly intense all the time for them, but they weren't conscious of it. The way the world had been had completely changed in a generation or two, and we now look at them and go, they were kind of crazy. There were some weird times there, those Victorian times, and I'm sure it was, it was because of the emergent technology. They were just completely whacked by it.
So let's talk about time travel. When you and I first met, I picked you up at the airport in Key West. You were appearing at the literary seminar there. I'm going to tell a story about our conversation, which may or may not be true, and I hope you'll correct me if your memory is different. I said that I was eager to talk to you because I was thinking about writing a book about the history of time travel, and you said that you were, what a coincidence, you were thinking of writing a book that actually involved time, that was time travel. And I think you even mentioned that it was going to be a particularly constrained type of time travel in which what went through time was not people or even objects, but only information, only messages, which struck me as absolutely fascinating. And I think then I said that it reminded me of the movie 12 Monkeys. Is that Terry Gilliam?
Yeah.
Starring Bruce Willis. I hope people have seen it. And Bruce Willis is a kind of unwilling time traveler, and one of the many wacky things in the movie is that when he needs to communicate with his masters in the future, he has to find a payphone and dial a special number and leave a message. I think this is yet another piece of futuristic fiction that preceded cell phones. And you said, oh yes, 12 Monkeys, that's a remake of La Jetée by Chris Marker. And I had no idea what you were talking about because I didn't know how you spelled La Jetée, which is French for the pier, the jetty, the pier. And I didn't understand how somebody French could be named Chris Marker. Can you explain?
Well, I don't know. One occasionally encounters French people in France who have Anglo names, and vice versa in England. And I assume Chris Marker was one of those. But Chris Marker probably, I've come to think over the years that of my career that Chris Marker was one of the key figures in my finding permission to try to write science fiction. And I had actually wanted to be a science fiction writer when I was 13 or 14 years old. Sort of daydreamed of it. I made a few, I wrote some juvenilia, and never finished anything. But puberty came along, and the world in the 60s with it, and a few years later, I assumed that science fiction was one of the childish things I had put aside. And I continued to read J.G. Ballard and a few other people writing something akin to science fiction. But by and large, I just sort of let it slide. And then I found myself a decade later, married, living in Canada, and an adult student studying for an undergraduate degree in English. And one of the courses I took, I think my freshman year at the University of British Columbia, was a film history course. And I had had no opportunity before. This was prior to videotape. So your only opportunity to see films in those days was to see them projected in a theater, or to see them on television. And television wasn't really offering much, and we didn't even have a television. So I took this film history course, and I got to see all of the great French New Wave films. All these films I'd been hearing about all my life, the Godard and Truffaut, but that I'd never actually seen. But in the course of that, one of the films one day was a film called La Jetée, which was a French film. And I vaguely remembered reading something about it in an article about science fiction films, that it said that it was French and it was weird. It didn't say that it was incredibly short, because it's a very, very short film. But so when I had heard about it, I'd assumed it was a full-length feature. So I went into this lecture hall, sat down knowing nothing about this film. The lights went down. The film began and it played. And when the lights came up, I was literally speechless. I have never been affected by a piece of cinema to that directly.
Let's stop just for a second and show, because we have 2 minutes of it. So let's look at 2 minutes and then continue.
The story of a man marked by an image of his childhood. The violent scene which upset him, and whose meaning he was to grasp only years later, happened on the main pier at Orly, Paris airport, sometime before the outbreak of World War III. Orly, Sunday. There the parents used to take their children to watch the departing planes. Of this particular Sunday, the child whose story we are going to tell was bound to remember the sight of a frozen sun, of a stage setting at the end of the pier, and of a woman's face. Nothing tells memories from ordinary moments. Only afterwards do they claim remembrance on account of their scars. That face, which was to be a unique image of peacetime to carry with him through the whole wartime, he often wondered if he had ever seen it, or if he had dreamed a lovely moment to catch up with the crazy moment that came next. The sudden roar of the woman's gesture, the fall of a body, shrieking people. Only later did he realize that he had seen a man dying. And soon afterwards, Paris was blown up.
The end of the world and the beginning of the movie. And it's a time travel movie.
I think I was 8 blocks away before I realized that that film consists almost entirely of stills. It was made with a 35mm still camera. But it's not, it doesn't consist entirely of stills. What that did to me was tell me that science fiction could be something else. There could be something completely other than the stuff I had grown up reading. It just kind of opened all sorts of possibilities, and then I never saw it again. I didn't. I had no, excuse me, no way of seeing it. And it came on the television one day when our daughter, who was our second child, was a little girl. And I said, oh, wow, this is the greatest movie. And so we sat and watched it, and it horrified her. It just made her feel terrible. And, you know, I was afraid that I'd traumatized her with La Jetée. But
thanks, Dad.
so actually something that I just happened to learn this in the last few months, so I mentioned it, was that when people went to, you know, journalists wrote about 12 Monkeys and said, this is, you know, this is terrible. Look what they've done to Chris Marker. Chris Marker can't be happy. Chris Marker said, it's an incredibly lovely film. These fools have no idea where cinema comes from.
So, given all of that, I don't want to ask you why you have finally written a novel of time travel. I really want to know why you didn't before. All those years developing a reputation as a writer about the future, as a futurist, and thinking about mixtures of the past and the future.
Well, I think that, to go back to that, our fateful meeting on the tarmac in Key West, I think that what may have happened is that your announcement that you were writing a book about time travel gave me permission to allow whatever I had been thinking about up to that moment to come forth. And that as soon as I told you that I was thinking of writing something that involved time travel, I actually was, in some different sense. You know, you gave me permission inadvertently to voice the possibility of doing it, which has an effect in the world. I had long had a fragment of an idea for a time travel story. I think it was one of the first story ideas that came up when I was trying to write short science fiction stories. And it's not even an idea, it's just a fragment of an idea. And it came from the first time I saw a CD, the very first CD that I ever handled. And it was kind of a magical artifact. And I'm not even sure the person who had it had a CD player. It was a completely new platform. And so I was looking at this thing and I was imagining when I looked at it, I imagined a scenario in which someone in 1967 has a new girlfriend, and she's only around for a little while, and then he never sees her again. But what he remembers is that she had this thing, this plastic mirror with a round plastic mirror with a hole through it in a funny transparent plastic case. And he's completely forgotten about it, but then he has the experience I had over a decade later being handed this strange object. But it never went anywhere, it never hooked up with anything else, it never assembled anything. And I became impatient with, I think over the years, I actually became impatient with this sort of paradoxes and puzzles of causality that some of the characters in the Peripheral are perhaps a little bit too straightforward in informing the reader. Those aren't possible, they say. In fact, not in this book. We're playing by different rules here. But other than that, I don't know what exactly it was. Once I had, and once I had actually started working on it, and I had Flynn and a little bit of her world, for a while I think I was entertaining the idea that it was all set in the one time frame, and that the time travel thing had once again proven to be a will-o'-the-wisp, and that I wouldn't do it. And then we went to London on a non-literary trip, and happened to see Nick Harkaway. And I was standing in Nick Harkaway's back garden, and he was telling me about how the government of the City of London works. I don't know whether he was telling me the truth or just making it up. And, he's got an imagination. But I just decided to take it for granted that was what he was telling me was how it really worked. And by the time I'd gotten back to the hotel, I'd changed the whole thing around again. And there were two time frames, and that was another beginning of it.
And can you say something about your relationship as a reader with time travel fiction early on? I mean, you've mentioned that you have a sort of distaste for the paradoxes, the convoluted, tricky stuff that you can get. Did you read, as a kid, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells?
Yes, I actually read my history with The Time Machine was that I read the Classics Illustrated comic of The Time Machine. Thought it didn't quite click. But then I found a comic book that was released to coincide with George Pal's film of The Time Machine. And that was eye-buggingly good. And then Pal's film was released, and it was, totally cosmically great for me at the time. And then I went back, reread the Classics Illustrated comic, and then went and found the text. And that's a very kind of modern story, I think, of encountering a work of classic literature. But it became a huge favorite of mine. And I thought of it, and I envisioned myself, in it, and really got into it in the way that kids do. But I never really found anything else that worked. Any other time travel fiction that worked for me that well, except for, is it Jack Finney, Time and Again?
Yeah.
Yeah, Jack Finney's Time and Again, in which the time machine is the Dakota Apartments, which is both a great time travel story and a great New York story. And Fritz Leiber's Change War stories, which I don't think there was a novel, but they were assembled in a book. And if someone were writing, if I was someone else writing about the Peripheral, I would go to those. It's been years since I've read them, but there are similar things going on. A war is being fought somewhere at the end of time by opposing forces, and they're human agents. Know them as the spiders and the snakes, and the spider symbol is an asterisk and the snake symbol is an S. And they fight all the way down the timeline, and essentially go into the deep past and set off causality bombs by changing something. And time winds blow up from the past and change everything. And that's actually described from the point of view of characters who are experiencing it. And they were really good. And I loved Liber. Liber was like my Heinlein, really. And so, but I think that was it for me. I think that and the Borges Garden of Forking Paths, and maybe in some arguable way, everything Borges ever wrote.
And we have a whole century of this stuff now, and you know, so it starts with H.G. Wells, and a guy just has a machine, and he can go anywhere he wants. And Jack Finney, the time machine, is his Dakota apartment, and he can go into the past. And what is it in the Michael J. Fox movies? I mean, and people have done every possible thing. There's a Heinlein story that involves going back into the past and having a sex change and becoming your own father and mother and son and daughter. And so with all of this stuff out there and a potential readership that's presumably comfortable with it, it feels as though you chose something very modest and restrained, where none of that stuff is possible. And as you say, somebody in the future says, oh, we can't do that. That's time travel. This is real.
Yeah.
And but the thing that's real is you can send messages. And I guess what makes that work is that we're starting to live in a real world where we have drones and we have virtual reality goggles and we have remote manipulators of various kinds. And so you're able to use all of this stuff as a way of leveraging mere information and acting in the physical world.
Well, as soon as I realized that I was thinking about, as soon as I started to think about a world in which a two-way exchange of information is possible between different times, I realized that it wasn't going to be a story about people sending email. It was going to be a story about telepresence and drones, and the manipulation of another time's whole digital realm. And one thing led to another, and then I found I had a technology in which a character from the past can, in effect, visit the future. And once I had that going, I was pretty much there. I think the part of the book that the early parts of the book that might be most likely to lose some readers are the parts that set up that possibility. And for whatever reason, I wanted a very elaborate and in some ways convincing setup for going through that membrane and finding yourself.
You mean lose people because it's hard?
Yeah, because not enough happens. There's not enough plot stuff going on for. There's not enough plot stuff going on in terms of my sense of the average genre recipe. Like it sort of asks you to, no, wait, take it easy. We're going to approach this very gradually, and maybe you're going to have a really weird experience as a result.
Okay, then I should say, because I wouldn't want this conversation to cost you any sales with all the talk of how people dress. There's crime, and there's murder, and it turns out there is a lot of plot, you have to admit. And the past is able, through pure information, to profoundly influence the future, and the future even more so to influence the past. At one point, maybe it's Detective Lowbeer, somebody has to warn somebody in the past, by the way, you could be murdered and we don't even, according to our laws, that's not even a crime because you're not real.
Yeah.
In setting it up, there's the technology that you use, or the aspect of the world that you use, is gaming. It involves gaming, and it strikes me that that's not a random choice. I mean, one thing it made me think of was in the origin story of the word cyberspace, which you invented 30 years ago, 32 years ago. I understand part of your conception of cyberspace came from seeing kids playing video games at an arcade?
Yes, well, from their body language as they played. I was always struck by how it seemed to me they actually wanted to reach through the screen. If they could have just gotten a hold of the Tetris bits, that was it. Like there was this incredibly intense physical intentionality on a notional space on the other side of the screen, and that they weren't seeing anything. They didn't need VR goggles. It was all about concentrating. But I was not myself that much of a gamer. But in the meantime, before I wrote The Peripheral, I got to watch our two children grow up with successive generations of video games. So that in large part is the experience from which the sense of gaming in the book comes from. It's like there was a period where my daughter was always sort of vaguely jet lagged because she had to stay up till 3 in the morning until the Japanese, or maybe it was the Australian players, came on in whatever multiplayer first-person shooter she was really into, because she said they were the best players, and they were several time zones away. And it's just a little bit of a jump from this girl's jet lagged because she's playing online shooters to this girl's got PTSD because she's been playing online shooters.
Because it's so easy to stumble into existential questions of what's real and what's not real. Mm-hmm. We talk about virtual reality,
yeah.
and artificial intelligence. And these gamers, even on those cheesy 1980s arcade games, clearly felt as though the world they were immersed in was as real as the world that was walking by outside on the street.
Yeah.
And so in this book, you have a gamer who, sorry, again, spoiler alert, for a while has no way of knowing whether the crimes that she is witnessing are real or part of a game. And there's something both powerful about that and kind of, I find, chilling in that it is reminding us of something about our own existence that's a little bit fragile. I mean, cyberspace, when you invented it, didn't exist, but now it's 30 years later, and cyberspace is all around us. We're living in it. I say we.
I think of cyberspace in 2014 as a piece of legacy terminology, but that's because I also think of the real world as a piece of legacy terminology. What we used to call cyberspace, what we called cyberspace 30 years ago, which was a realm other than this one, has completely and successfully colonized what we used to think of as the real world. And the two are one, but without what used to be the cyberspace element, we can't really exist. We can't have a bank account. We would scarcely exist. We'd have no social media profile.
And it's changing our relationship with time in some peculiar way that I struggle to get a grip on. I mean, it feels as though in cyberspace we are sending pieces of ourselves to the past, or we are witnessing the past much more vividly than.
Or recovering. We're able to recover evidence of our past selves, or to have it recovered for us, which can be terribly embarrassing and damaging to one's career. It's an atemporal realm, but it's not that cyberspace is an atemporal realm, but this has become an atemporal realm.
This being the real world.
Yeah, the real world has become, and that's because all of this, I think, all of this stuff constitutes a species-wide prosthetic memory. I think we are that which develops better and better forms of prosthetic memory. We've been doing it since we cut notches on pieces of bone to count the number of buffaloes or whatever led them to cut those notches on pieces of bone.
So it could be that the era of time travel is now coming to an end. We won't need it anymore because we'll be living it, and you'll have written one of the last time travel novels ever.
It would be possible, but the history of genre so far leads me to think not.
Well, our time has gone by much faster than I expected it to, but I want to ask you maybe one final question about, without giving anything else away about the book. I've heard people disagreeing about whether the book has a happy ending, whether the book is ultimately optimistic or a book of despair. And in thinking about it myself, I think it's partly because there are personal stories, there are the stories of the individuals and their conflicts and their relationships, and of course there's also a socio-political story taking place, maybe two, one in the near future and one in the not so near future. Maybe I shouldn't be answering my own question, but maybe one of them has a happier ending than another. Is it fair for me to ask you what you think?
It's fair, although I hadn't realized we'd used up so much of our time, because I actually had at least one question to ask you, but maybe I'll answer yours and ask you a quick one.
All right.
Okay. It seems to me, having had the completed manuscript in existence since mid-July, and that was when it was finally put to bed to go to press. I've come to think that even though I didn't plan it that way, in any conscious way, the two chapters at the end, the last chapter and the penultimate chapter that precedes it, have wound up constituting a litmus test of the reader's socio-political and historical sophistication. And if you're at that stage of life where you aren't yet aware that a happy ending is a matter of when they roll the credits and nothing else, you could look at this book and go, well, that's kind of a goofily happy ending. But if you're a little more sophisticated, you could look at it and you could keep looking at it and you could just keep getting more and more frightened. Both of those final chapters, I mean, honestly, when I finished them, and I kind of know there's like this noise that isn't a noise. It's like something kind of goes chunk. And I know a book is over. And I may still have some work to do, but I know that I found the end of that book. And that definitely happened. And I kind of looked at them and I went, whoa, that's some of the creepiest stuff I've ever written. So, when I saw the first review said, well, up to his old tricks, absurdly optimistic. Well, I don't know. But it's, some of them are doing pretty good when the credits roll, so there you go. Now, but what I wish I had asked you earlier, because now you can escape the answer, is that given your obvious skill as a reader, and your obvious skill as a reader of fiction, and your obvious skill as a writer of nonfiction, have you never been tempted by the prospect of writing a piece of fiction? Because you appear to me to have every qualification.
Oh, this is going to be such an anticlimactic way to end this conversation. I wish we could have ended it 120 seconds ago. And I'm just going to, but I'll answer the question honestly. Yes, of course I've been tempted. I do read almost exclusively fiction. I don't care that, I mean, there's some wonderful nonfiction, and I don't mean to piss on the whole genre that I write in, but I much prefer to read fiction. And so, of course, I wish I could write it, but I think there's a piece missing that you have that I do not have, and It involves making stuff up. Well, that's good. Because the stuff you're making up is telling us the truth about the world that we're living in and the world we're hurtling toward. And I'm lucky if I can figure out what has happened in the past and what's happening now. I figured that's my job, and it's...
Well, I in turn, and I have been occasionally asked whether or not I would entertain the idea of writing nonfiction, I always say, but they won't let you make anything up.
There it is.
So I get it. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.